Welcome, everybody. I'm George Karayiannis, and you're listening to Branding for Greeks, the first Greek podcast about brands and branding. A chance to explore how brands are built, how we perceive them, what branding really means, the tools it uses, and how it can help businesses, from startups to multinationals, grow the value of the brands they manage. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure how many of you remember that from the initial season where I dedicated the mini-series of 2 episodes to the history of branding. Despite gathering a wealth of information from various sources, I noticed a significant gap in the coverage of the influence of branding agencies. I made the promise back then, if you remember, to dive deeper into the impact of branding agencies, engaging with those that they have played a pivotal role in the evolution of branding. Today, I'm thrilled to explore some fascinating stories and highlighting the pivotal role of an agency that has been a trailblazer in the evolution of the branding industry. And that agency is Landor. I have the honor of speaking with Emma Beckmann, Group Chief Growth Officer at Landor. With 30 years of experience at the agency, she's undoubtedly one of the best person to share insights and stories about Landor's remarkable journey. Emma, good morning and welcome to Branding for Greeks.
Good morning, George, and thank you very much for having me.
I'm truly honored that you accepted my invitation, and I want to thank you once again for taking the time for this interview. Landor is an agency that many of us dream of working for, and its work has always been a source of inspiration. Walter Landor, in particular, is like a mentor to many of us. His approach and methodologies have shaped how we understand branding today. Also, I want to make a special note here before we begin. Landor was the first agency that responded positively and wholeheartedly to assist me in shedding light on the history of branding and the crucial role that branding agencies have played in shaping our industry. I believe this is aligned with their deeply rooted philosophy of spreading the value of branding. But okay, enough with me mumbling. Let's dive in the history of Landor. First of all, before we begin, can you tell me a few words about you and your role in Landor?
Of course, as you said in your introduction, I'm the Chief Growth Officer for the Landor Group. So ultimately responsible for all things that deliver net new business for the agency. So from brand and reputation marketing to demand and lead generation, through to pitching and best practice pitching for our teams around the world, and ultimately ensuring that our teams have the tools and the knowledge that they need to win and grow the clients that they look after, or the clients that they win and then go on to look after. So it's quite a broad role, but one that I enjoy massively. It enables me to touch multiple parts of the business, but also work with many of the colleagues around the world, many of whom actually I've also grown up with, as you mentioned earlier. So this year I'm celebrating 30 years with Landor, and over that period, whilst it's very much still the same company culture spirit, obviously the world has evolved, the company has evolved. And in that time, I've worked in London, I've worked in Germany. I then went out to Moscow and I set up our Moscow office, and then returned back to London in 2016, and one of the things that I find extremely, fascinating is that I'm not an anomaly. I think I might be the first or second current employee in Landor to actually make it to 30 years. And I have many colleagues around the world who have been with Landor for 20 years plus. So it's great to have a number of colleagues around the world who share similar stories and memories to myself.
Sounds so exciting journey. And also, I have to say that probably we are sure that you're doing a great job, since the brands that Landor handles are love brands all around the world.
Yeah, we're very lucky with the clients that we have.
This is perfect. Walter Landor moved to the United States in 1939 and established Landor Associates in 1941 in San Francisco with his wife Josephine as his first, let's say, associate. Initially, the company was a small design studio, but under his leadership, it grew into a global brand consultancy known for its groundbreaking work in corporate identity and strategic branding. Can you provide us with an overview of the founding of Landor and its early years? What inspired the creation of Landor, and what was the initial vision behind the agency?
I think it was around 1939 when he first traveled to the US for a something to do with Expo. The
It was an exhibition, an art exhibition, I think, regarding his studies.
Exactly, and was representing had some work also represented at the British Pavilion. And he stayed in the US and he traveled across the US to the West Coast, and ultimately ended up in San Francisco. And I think this story is, really, key to, how he thought about, design and his vision really for Landor at the time when he arrived in San Francisco. He felt that it was a city, and he's quoted in saying this, a city that looked out on the whole world and a city that combined the cultural traditions of East and West. And so he could think of no better place to really set up what was then Landor and Associates, as you correctly said, with his wife Josephine, from their flat in Russian Hill at the time. As he, moved on and started to, develop the business, I mean, even back in those early days of the 40s, and you can imagine the world coming out of World War II. He was one of the first to use consumer research in packaging design. And widely credited with establishing the economic value of design and effective visual communication in business. Something that I think all of your listeners today would recognize as the status quo. And I think, that was his vision from the early days. And I think it's that legacy of pioneering and pioneering the field of branding that's driven many Landorians around the world ever since. I think, we strive as a business, as an agency, but also, a leader in the category to continue to pioneer in the field of branding and to ultimately lead the conversation. And I think there's a very clear link back um, to Walter and the spirit and the ambition that he had for Landor when he first set it up.
That's an amazing story, an amazing journey. What was that sparked him and made him start this journey?
what sparked him? I mean, obviously he had a passion, for design and for the craft of design, as well. And I think he had a vision that, good design really could change the world. Bad design, not so much. Um, and that really, was, at the heart of everything, that he did. That, belief that, creativity and design in particular could contribute to, solving many, of the problems in the world around us. Now, I mean, that sounds like quite a big, lofty, ambition. But I think, one that, one that really drove him, and, particularly, the idea that, products had personalities and they were like people, and, really kind of, inspiring thinking, that was just at the heart of everything, that he did. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite, quotes from Walter, is that, good design can change the world, bad design not so much.
It's really amazing and inspiring. Can you mention some of the agency's key milestones throughout its history?
Yeah, I mean, it's an 80 plus, what is it now? 83 year history. So, there are many milestones that I could talk about, but I think one of the things that, um, always fascinated me most about, the development of Landor was Walter's, client centricity from the very start. In an industry which, traditionally and still today is, very much a project-based business, as opposed to, a retainer business, as with our, colleagues in other fields of, communications and advertising. He built the business based on the relationships that, he built with clients and the work that he was doing, and ultimately followed clients around the world. So, when you think about, the key milestones in terms of how Landor grew geographically, um, he opened an office where he had a client that needed, support. So, Tokyo was the first office to be opened, outside of, the US and outside of, San Francisco. And that was off the back of working with Sapporo, the beer, where, not only, was he personally involved in setting up that team and leading that work in Tokyo, he was also the face of the advertising for Sapporo as well. So, if you go back
Oh,
in the archives, you'll see many pictures of Walter holding a can of Sapporo and smiling into the camera. The third office to be opened after Tokyo was Italy, and that was Rome, and that was off the back of, Alitalia, winning, the Alitalia, redesign in the 1970s. Again, Walter personally very involved in that, spent a lot of time, in Italy, and that was the start of our Italian business. And then, next, London, slightly later, end of the 1980s, actually not long before I joined Landor. But that was off the back of, British Airways and winning the British Airways account. And, I think that work in particular has, remained iconic, whilst the British Airways, design itself and brand has changed over the years. The iconic livery that was created by Landor back then is still known as the Landor livery. And I think it even had an outing last year, maybe the year before, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of British Airways, and is still referred to by, airplane aficionados and British Airways staff internally as the Landor livery. So that, I think, the reason I talk about those particular milestones is Landor really was one of or was one of the only network agencies that until recently grew exclusively organically, rather than through acquisitions or partnerships in markets. So, offices were opened around the world, as I just described, based on client relationships. And a Landorian was always sent to do the job. So, building the team and a Landor culture um, in those markets. In fact, it's exactly the reason that I went to Hamburg back in 1997, was to be part of the founding team for Landor in Germany, and then 15 years later moving to Moscow to set up our operations in Landor and in Russia. And I think what this did was enable and foster a culture that underpins, our thinking in everything that we do. It's enabled a group of people around the world who were able to, work together seamlessly, but also, follow, deploy the same methodologies. So if you were talking to Landor in Tokyo, you'd be having, similar conversation, talking about the same frameworks and tools as Landor in San Francisco. And I truly believe that that was very unique for Landor, in comparison to many other network agencies today. So I think there's a lot of those early milestones really kind of like got us to the homogenous culture that we have today. And then, other key milestones, 1989 was when Landor Associates was acquired by Young and Rubicam, and we joined the Young and Rubicam group. And then, in turn, I think probably the next big milestone was becoming part of WPP
WPP.
in 1993 through the acquisition of Y&R. There's many more kind of like milestones that I could talk about, but I think probably in recent times the key milestones have been more centered around integration of broader capabilities into Landor and into the Landor group. Um, so, I think of the acquisition of Man versus Machine in 2016, which is, one of the world's leading motion identity agencies, or the integration and the realignment of Fitch into to Landor in 2018, which brought, you know, a different set of capabilities built by another pioneer, Rodney Fitch, into the family. And I think that's continued with the acquisition of AMP back in 2023, which is one of the leading sonic branding agencies in the world. That's also expanded capabilities. And more recently this year, agencies within WPP like BDG, who specialize in workspace design, and Deep Local in the US, who are experts in experiential and creative tech, have all been aligned around the Landor offer. And I think, that really kind of like brings us the breadth and depth of capability and skill sets that we have today, which, honestly, I think, many others would struggle to match that. So it's kind of like a tale of, when I reflect back, it's probably, a tale of two halves. The first, 40 odd years of Landor's history, probably longer actually, focused on growing organically and growing with our clients. And then, as the world has changed and, clients' needs have changed and, branding capabilities have had to adapt with that, bringing in smart, different capabilities and skill sets has really been the focus for growth for Landor over the last 10 years or so.
Growing with your clients must means that the clients trust you and trust your instincts and your talent and decide to go with you on a journey that might seem difficult. I mean, a new client deciding to open with you an office and go with you in a new office in Tokyo or in London, since you are from another country, it seems that it trusts you a lot and decides to go with you on that journey. This is great,
Yeah.
and apparently it's a showcase of the philosophy of the agency. How, as you said, we work together with the clients and the value we bring to that designs. All these years and through these acquisitions and changes, you still remain Landor. And I believe the power of your brand in our market, in our industry, gives you uh, that liberation to keep working with your values and your framework, your workflows, etc.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, there, particularly over the last few years, there has been, consolidation of agency brands into kind of like, bigger networks. I think the strength of the Landor brand is probably, testimony to the fact that we still exist after 80 years in the changing world. But I think, many people, around the world, recognize the name and can associate something with the name. May not always be, Walter Landor, and it does vary from, market to market. I would say, almost consistently in all of the markets that we operate in, we enjoy a strong reputation. And as we know, reputations have to be earned, but more importantly, reputations have to be lived up to as well. And I think that is, one of the, big obligations that we have as, as a Landor leadership team, but also, as Landorians across the world. We have an obligation to maintain the reputation, that was built by so many over such a long period of time. So, yeah, I think, we're very lucky that we have a brand which is so strong, that stands out, in the market. And for many years there was a perception, and I think, this probably, still holds true to a degree, but for many years there was a perception, or even a saying, that you don't get fired for hiring Landor, or a safe pair, a safe pair of hands. I think, that can also be a double-edged sword. We don't only want to be a safe pair of hands, but largely, I would hope that, that saying still kind of like holds true.
Yeah. One of Walter Landor's famous quotes, and probably it has to do also with what we said before about the perception of the brand, is that products are made in the factory, but brands are created in the mind. Can you tell us how Landor defines branding and today, and how this definition evolved over the years?
Yeah, sure. I mean that quote in particular, one of the many famous quotes from Walter that we still use today, and I think that quote in particular um, perfectly encapsulates the essence of branding and is actually timeless. It's
Yeah,
as relevant
indeed.
today as it was, back then, because it's really about, perception, emotion, and the intangible connections that people form with a product or a service or, a company. Um, and I think there are others as well. I mean, some of my favorites. A brand is a promise. A great brand is a promise kept. I think that quote as well inherently implies that a brand or branding is not just a one-off thing or a one-off event, but it's something that you constantly have to um, constantly have to work at. Another quote in a similar vein: "A brand is a story that's never completely told." I think that emphasizes the dynamic and evolving nature of brands, and that brands are built over time through every single interaction and experience that a consumer or a customer has with a brand. So I think. And I have a whole book of quotes actually somewhere, which I must dig out. You've just reminded me about it.
You should.
With quotes from Walter Landor across many, many different topics as well, including things like politics. And I'm sure there's lots of insights there as well.
Yes, that's true.
But I think these insights and many and those quotes and many more like that. I think they continue to inspire and guide not only Landorians around the world today, but I think brand builders around the world today. And that for me is a truly kind of like fascinating legacy. I think you know, branding in terms of how we define it today is ultimately a way of communicating a truly relevant and differentiating promise to consumers. And companies, brands, brand owners now automatically invest in building, in maintaining, in nurturing, but also measuring their brands to ensure that the promise is not just made, it's a promise that is kept. And and if it's not quite hitting, needs adjustment, then then they adjust. So it really is, when you think about branding in that context, a continuous cycle of activity. And I think that has that the business that we did 80 years ago may have been very different, as ultimately really informed businesses see and manage their brands today. And I think brand is now recognized as essential and essential component of business success. And I think ultimately, a very valuable intangible asset that can be measured in terms of its value on the balance sheet. And I think, that's, ultimately, um, what brands deserve.
I really love what you said here. It's something that it's truly concerns me how, of course, smaller agencies, not like yours, can prove the value of their work. But it's another story. Don't go into that.
That could be on its own.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true, and not only. um, all this success, of course, probably comes from some core principles and some methodologies that guides Landor's branding strategies. I don't know if you can share some of these methodologies with us and how these also strategies have evolved uh, and adapted to the changes of our industry or to the changes of the brands.
Methodologies, tools, terminology, I think, many have evolved. I think many agencies use, similar language, and rightly so, talk about brand in the right way. I think there are, for me, there is one constant in how, we have, always looked at brand, and how we continue to look at brand today. And I think, that is really about, excuse me, the core principles of relevance and differentiation. I think it can't just be about one or the other. You can't be different for the sake of being different, but not be relevant to your audiences, and you can't be relevant to your audiences, but not stand out from the crowd that is also, trying to talk to your audiences. And so, differentiation in the world of brand needs to be meaningful. And I think this was a core principle, or the principle of relevance and differentiation was a core principle of, Walter's when he created a very early version of what today is called brand asset valuator, or BAV. That was a tool or a framework, a way of thinking about brands, that was then picked up and developed by Y&R. They helped Landor to put a lot of investment into that, and is today managed by a central WPP team to the benefit of all WPP agencies. And Brand Asset Valuator is the world's largest consumer database for brands, and the BAV framework, underpins our, thinking in terms of everything we do. It doesn't only enable us to, analyze and measure brand strength, which is the combination of relevance and differentiation. It also enables us to analyze what we call brand stature, which is the combination of esteem and
Hmm.
knowledge.
Hmm.
So, that's ultimately about how well a brand is known and ultimately liked by its consumers. And by analyzing a brand's performance against these four pillars of differentiation, relevance, esteem, knowledge, over time, and we're able to do that within their category, but also with outside of the category, and with other benchmarks, we're able to diagnose the health of a brand at any given time in its life cycle and adjust accordingly. And so, when I think about tools, platforms, brand positioning, purpose, values. Do we call them values? Do we call them attributes? There's a lot of terminology and different frameworks out there. I think all of them have their place, but for me, the principles of BAV, or the principles that led to BAV and started with Landor and Walter Landor around relevance and differentiation, but really underpin not just what we do as a branding agency, but ultimately, all of WPP and all of the facets of communication. I think that's a huge testament um, to Walter again, but also to some of those core principles that we, as an industry, and agencies that work within that industry have.
You mentioned some projects that was milestones during the, let's say, the expansion to other countries of Landor. Are there any other projects that you could mention as significant to the history of Landor, or also shaped in a way the branding industry?
I think if I go back to the really early days, there are, you know, I mean, just looking at the list of some of the brands that, Walter not only worked with, but he created, I think is, just mind blowing. Logos like the World Wildlife Fund, the Marlborough House, Levi's, Kellogg's, 3M. Singapore Airlines, Del Monte, Bank of America, Disney, and we have archive footage of Walter Landor working with Walter Disney, and looking, creating marks that are iconic and part of as much a part of our culture today as they were back then. So there are many, many, famous, uh, brands from his work in the early days. But I think there are also, significant projects that have shaped our reputation since. I mean, one of my personal favorites, and I still use this in credentials presentations today, where it's relevant, is the creation of the FedEx mark in the late 80s. That still, often makes the top 10 of the best logos ever created. That for me is, the standout of the 80s. Then I think about, the 90s when I first joined Landor. We worked with Pepsi, and I don't know if you remember Pepsi turned blue, and we worked on that, and the idea of turning Pepsi blue at the time was such a bold idea. And it was done, it was launched, it was revealed with huge fanfare that you rarely see today. With other campaigns. But I remember we had a Concorde from British Airways that was painted blue and flew from London to New York as part of that big reveal and launch. And then in the early noughties, you then have projects like BP, and we created the BP Helios um, in 2000, 2001, and 24 years later, that is a brand and a mark, and a relationship actually as well, that is still going strong today. So I think there are many, and I'm sure there are many that I have forgotten or left out there, but I think it's not just about the famous, most well-known brands, or that work that has shaped, I think, our reputation. I think we continue today to do work around the world that has shaped the branding industry as well in certain regions. And just to give you a couple of examples there, I think about the creation of Neom in 2017 in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That was a destination brand, or a brand for a region, being built in service of the 2030 vision, which at the time, none of us could really, comprehend. It was a vision that was, 13 years off, many years off, actually breaking ground and starting, to build this new region within the kingdom. But it was a fascinating process, a fascinating kind of like identity and result that, has been a benchmark for a lot of the branding work that has followed in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia since. I mean, we often see it in RFPs as, the benchmark. We want to be like Neom. And we go, you do realise we're the ones that created. We can't keep doing that for um, every single brand. But I think that for me is an iconic piece of work, which really moved the branding industry as a whole and the potential of brand in Saudi in particular, but in that region. And many agencies have, benefited from that since. And more recently, and this is a very recent example, 2 weeks ago, we were privileged to be in Madrid with our client from Cepsa, which is one of Spain's um, uh, the second largest energy company in Spain, and in fact, a brand that Walter Landor created in 1972 to support them, moving from Cepsa to a completely new brand, Mueve, to signal the change in their business transformation and the journey that they've been on for the last 2.5 years. It was a big, brave move by the client, and I think one that, in the context of the industry, but also in the context of the region, and Iberia, has had a lot of attention, and I think will be, or is one of the biggest rebrands that Spain has seen for many years. So I think I'm proud of the fact that um, we continue to at least try and follow in Walter's footsteps, and create brands, marks, solutions to problems. And I think that's the key point. All of this is in service of solving a client problem or a client challenge or a business problem. We would never recommend, changing something for the sake of changing something. And quite often, on strategic engagements that we have, design is very often not necessarily the answer to the challenge that the client has. So yeah, I'm personally proud that we continue to to try and follow in Walter's footsteps, and still have those iconic, let's say, industry shaping projects and clients that we're really proud of.
I think you're doing a great job of
Hope-
following his
I
steps.
keep thinking to myself, hopefully in 30 years' time, there'll still be someone in Landor talking really passionately about the work we're doing today. Who knows?
It must be amazing being a Landorian, as you say, and walking through your city or starting your day, and having interaction with so many brands that the company that you work have designed or worked with, or I mean, because probably you have been crucial part of the teams that they developed all these projects.
Yeah, actually, I have to say, I probably, notice it less these days. But the fascinating thing actually is my kids. So obviously, my kids have grown up um, only, knowing mummy works at Landor. And I'll never forget the day we landed in Moscow as a family. Um, and we're moving there for me to set up the agency in Moscow. We're on the runway in Moscow Sheremetyevo, and taxiing to the gate. And my 7-year-old son at the time kind of like looked out of the window, and there was an S7 plane that was taxiing out to take off. And this was S7 that had been rebranded by Landor, probably about 5, 6 years before that. Maybe not quite. It'd been recently rebranded by Landor, and this bright green, plane with S7 on the side is taxiing past our Aeroflot plane, and my 8-year-old goes around, "Mummy, is that the plane that you designed?" Yes, because I mean, obviously, I've never been a designer in my life. I actually can't even particularly draw, matchstick men, very well. So I can't claim to, really have, designed the S7 plane. Um, but that was what my children believed, because they followed what mummy did and where mummy was going and who she was working with, and and still to this day, at the age of 21, 20, and 16, will mention to their friends when we're walking down, or they see something and they go, "Oh, mummy's company did that," or etc. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure who I've who I've influenced most. I mean, I don't really spot them anymore, because I think the brands that Landor have touched over the years are so omnipresent. But I find it fascinating that my children are very aware of, and they're one of the best competitors. In You may be aware of a board game called around logos. I think there are app versions of it as well, where you see part of a logo or a typeface, and you have to guess the logo, and it gets harder as it goes on. My kids beat me hands down on that, and then they'll go, "But mummy, you should know the answer to that. You created that." And it's like, oh God,
Oh God.
my mum is fading. Theirs isn't. So it's definitely a proud moment when you see a lot of that work that to be honest has never really touched my kids' lives in terms of some of the brands, but when they recognize not only the work that I've been involved in in the 20 odd years that they've had me as a mother, but when they recognize brands that Walter created 70, 80 years ago.
It's amazing, amazing. It's so warm and so touching. All this story. I was planning to ask you something about Landor's anecdote, but I think I will stay with your story. I loved it.
That's an Emma anecdote. But there are there are some there are fascinating Landor anecdotes as well. And I think just bringing it back for a moment, on a serious note, I think when I was very lucky when I started at Landor in the early 90s, that I was surrounded by people who either had worked with Landor personally or with Walter personally, and or had worked on the boat, the Klamath, in San
Yeah,
Francisco, which didn't go out of service until around 1989, the end of the 80s. So I joined in 94, and so there were many people who had been on the boat, who had worked on the boat, and could tell you all kinds of stories about. And I just found that fascinating as a 20 something, fresh out of university, kind of like graduate, who fell into design, to be honest, and really only fell into design because I happened to speak German, and I wanted to do something where I could use my language. And there was a role at Landor for a marketing assistant, with a focus on the German speaking markets. But being surrounded by people who would visit from San Francisco or from Tokyo or from Hong Kong, and these people had been in Landor for 15, 20, 25 years at the time, And we had a tradition of doing and telling campfire stories. So, when people were visiting, they would always, there would always be a lunch and learn. There would be, a moment where the agency would come together with some pizza and a few drinks, and people would tell, these fascinating stories about the parties that Walter used to, have on the boat in San Francisco. The Hollywood kind of like A-list celebrities that would travel to San Francisco for a Landor party on a Friday night on the boat, or parties with, famous, musicians and bands from the time. I think, there was a lot of that which, for someone starting out in their career, was, truly inspiring. And I still, use every opportunity that I have today to tell some of those, stories, because, naturally, with time, I mean, we have a lot of, stuff in the archives. We share a lot of this, but, just some of those personal stories around, around the boat, around, the parties that happened on the boat. It was, I talked earlier about, pioneering, consumer research. I mean, Walter built a supermarket shelf on the boat in the Clement.
I've read that. It's amazing. Yes.
And would, when he was designing the Kellogg's packaging, and you've got to remember, in those days, they're not printing packs, they're hand drawing packs, and then they're building the packs, and then they're building a fake shelf. And then he's going out onto, Pier 5 and bringing in kind of like San Francisco housewives and standing them in front of the shelves, and, asking them what they see and what do they see first. I mean, a really, really, really early version of, eye tracking. Walter stood there, and those, those stories, I just find, absolutely, absolutely fascinating. And I think, you know it really captures, um who he was as a person, but really, his vision for what we do. And I think, why, it's certainly what inspired me to to think, okay, I'm in a really exciting place here, and, ultimately to still be here 30 years later.
But we talked about global brands. We talked about how Walter Landor shaped the branding industry. The story that you mentioned right now, it changed the way we measure our designs, we measure packaging, we measure branding, etc. Why, when we are searching about the history of branding, why do we often find more references to advertising agencies and rather than branding agencies like yours? What happened there?
I mean, I think, I think Walter Landor, has come from a very specific part of what ultimately has contributed to where branding is today. I think, it, in the early days, it was very much about, design, and, um, the craft of design, and, whether that was through a logo and a letterhead, or, on a packaging, piece of packaging itself, like the Kellogg's pack that we just talked about. And I think when you compare the impact or the visibility of that to, TV commercials, in the past, much more broadly, seen and visible um, to to consumers and the general public. So I think I think from the kind of like the skill sets that we've come from, I think there are multiple and advertising agencies you know can also take a lot of kind of like credit in establishing the role of brand and the importance of brand. But I think when you look back at you know if when you look back at who is kind of like connected with pioneering the brand agency. I mean, J. Walter Thompson was one of the first agencies that really was connected with the importance of brand, and possibly that was at a time before Walter had even set up Landor. David Ogilvy, another name, very rightly so connected with building the importance of brand. Wally Olins, Rodney Fitch, I mentioned before. I think there are so many people, agencies, but also companies and marketeers, like people like Neil McElroy at Procter and Gamble, who championed brand management for each product with its own personality and marketing strategy. I mean, that was also a game changer for the branding industry. So I think, in short, I think it has been the industry and the role of brand and branding has been a culmination of many efforts by many different players over time. Um, I think it depends, also, where you search. I think, if you ask Chat GPT today, who was the founder of branding, it would probably tell you Walter Landor. But no, all seriousness, I think Walter and many others like Wally Olins, etc., played a massive role in defining the industry that we work in today. But I think there are many others. From advertising agencies to companies and marketers themselves that have all contributed. So
Okay, great. I want to ask you, what do you think, from your experience, that will be the next big trends or the changes in the field of branding, and how is Landor preparing for these changes?
I mean, obviously, the big one is AI. Not just branding, but I think across all,
Society, yeah.
society as a whole. But I think in the context of in the context of brands and branding, I think AI powered personalization, um, is going to is going to change the face of branding. I think hyper personalized messaging, product recommendations, and maybe even dynamic pricing in the future. I think that will require brands to ethically collect and utilize data whilst respecting kind of like privacy and privacy concerns. Um, so I think there's going to be, a big shift there. Generative AI, obviously, it's something that many people are thinking about, and how that changes the way that we work as agencies as well. I think we're very lucky as part of WPP that there has been huge investment, by WPP for our clients and our agencies into an enterprise based open AI system, which we're all able to use, and enables us to, to benefit from, effectiveness and efficiencies to augment creativity. I think we're all clear that, AI doesn't replace the need for humans, and won't replace the need for humans and human creativity, but it will certainly, change the way that we work. And I think, the the shape of, teams going forward. I think, different skill sets will be required. And, who knows how long dinosaurs like me will be required. But even I can use OpenAI. And the WPP open platform is, as I said, we're very lucky that we're not having to, work out the impact of AI and generative AI, ourselves. There is a machine that is leading that conversation, not just in terms of how we as agencies work, but also how it can be applied, to our clients and our client relationships across the board. So I think, that's obviously one big shift, which is, going to change the way that we work. I think, specifically within branding, I think, we are seeing, a need for more inclusive and accessible branding. So ensuring that, brands resonate with diverse audiences and their customers, whether that's, through empathy, through authenticity, but a deep understanding of, people's very different, needs and challenges that they face, whether, that's language, culture, disabilities, socioeconomic. And, we do a lot of work with clients to help them innovate around accessible design, based on insights that really drive that, and true kind of like understanding of different human needs. So I think that will become an increasing trend. What else can I think of? I think, the other thing I think is, what I would call, agile and adaptive branding. I think the only constant in today's world is change. And, brands need to constantly adapt and evolve their strategies, and messaging to stay relevant. In a world, which is, a fragmented media landscape, and, you know you're not always in control of, your brands, and, stories about your brands are being created by, many different, channels, influencers, and those things. So I think, that also requires, a very different approach to branding, but also the way that we work with our clients, the willingness to experiment and to try things out, the willingness, or, a culture of continuous learning, of, trialing and, adapting, and, maybe trying something and then throwing it out and trying something different. I think, in the old days, there was a strict kind of like branding process with different phases that you followed from, A to Z. Very few of our approaches and methodologies. We may have a plan when we kick off a program with a client, but very rarely is that plan the same plan that we actually end up, working against, because we have to adapt, and we have to be, flexible to that change. And I think, through all of these changes, but particularly, particularly the the changing media landscape and the world at whole. I think brands have never been in as vulnerable as they are today. And I think um, branding agencies have to evolve from being primarily kind of like creative service providers to strategic partners that can help brands navigate the complexities in this fragmented landscape and build meaningful experiences with audiences wherever they need to and wherever they show up. So I think, in short, I think, we certainly, as Landor, see our role as, helping to make brands, less vulnerable and more valuable for the audiences that they interact with, and for the clients and the brand owners that, you know, invest in them.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. As you said, constant change, and we have to adapt all the time, learning new things. And what was something new yesterday probably will be old the next day.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you rarely hear people talking about metaverse these days.
Yeah. Uh, Emma, thank you so much for joining me today on Branding for Greeks. It was an absolute pleasure to hear your insights on Landor's incredible contribution to the world of branding and how the agency has shaped and continues to influence the branding industry. I know that our listeners will greatly benefit from your insights and the fascinating history of Landor. I'm truly honored to have had you on the show, and I'm looking forward to see how Landor will continue to lead and innovate in the world of branding. Once again, thank you very much for sharing your time and your laurels with us. And I hope we might continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and I'd be delighted to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also like to say a big thank to our listeners for tuning in. Stay inspired, keep exploring the power of branding, and until next time, don't forget, everything is branding. Let's begin. You've just listened to another episode of the Branding for Greeks podcast with me, George Karayiannis. Until the next one, I wish you all the best. And don't forget, everything is branding.